Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined by Isaiah Maldonado, our Post-Gazette and Daily Collegian Penn State insider for our weekly Penn State football podcast. This is our usual spot. On Wednesdays, we were here on Sunday as well, talking about the firing of James Franklin, what led up to it. Today, we're going to focus on the path forward for the Nittany Lions, who on the list of potential replacements appeals to Isaiah and myself. Who are we not so keen on? So not a lot of football talk. The season is functionally, they're going to play a game this weekend. Penn State is a 2.5-point underdog against the Iowa Hawkeyes in prime time this week, according to our friends at FanDuel. So make sure you check them out if you'd like to place a wager. But the results are relatively moot at this point, Isaiah. A lot of these players may or may not be on this roster a year from now. There's going to be a new coach. So a lot's going to change. So, do the results matter? Who knows? So we're just going to talk about potential replacement coaches. I wrote up a list of about 10 coaches over on postgazette.com that we're going to kind of go through as our starting point today. People I think Penn State will target for sure, just because of can't miss resumes, and also some names I think they should target. We're going to get Isaiah's thoughts on those and maybe a couple other names that might be floating out there. So let's dive into it. The show's presented by FanDuel. So excited to chat. Let's start with Curt Cignetti, Isaiah. We talked a little bit about him on Sunday when we did our breaking news show. Obviously, his success at Indiana somewhat speaks for itself, getting to them to the college football playoff a year ago, off to an undefeated start this season, the big win against Oregon. He's doing some good things at a place that is not historically known for football, does not have the resources available to it that Penn State does. He probably is a guy that would not be available to Penn State, except for the fact that he is a Pennsylvania guy. Went to West Virginia for college, coached at Pitt for a period of time, coached at IUP, not too far from Penn State. So he knows this area. He knows the recruiting base. He has some level of reverence for the program, having grown up around it to some degree. So, Isaiah, I think the question is, would Curt Cignetti want to come to Penn State? That seems like the big point of debate for a lot of people. He seems like he's in a pretty decent spot with Indiana. I kind of bristle at the suggestion that he would not want more money at Penn State if that was offered to him. Indiana is still Indiana for football. It still has a long way to go in terms of program building. You figure he could take a good chunk of the roster from Indiana to Penn State if that's what he wanted to do. So to me, it's a question of where do you have a better chance to win? And anyone making the argument that you have a better chance to win in Indiana long-term than at Penn State, I think is incorrect.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, what Cignetti has been able to do so far in his past year and a half, 2 years, give or take, at Indiana has been very impressive, only having, one loss in the regular season. It's definitely something that his accomplishments are going to catch the eye of those at Penn State to try and bring somebody in who's been able to have that level of success in the Big Ten so far. But I think, like you said, the biggest question is, would he want to leave? And I don't know if I would necessarily want to leave if I was Cignetti. I feel like if I was him, what I've been able to accomplish at Indiana, given the fact that it has less resources and the market for football there and a historical program in terms of how football has been played there, it's much smaller. And I think that gives you more notoriety as a head coach. I think people are going to give him a lot more props for what he's been able to do at Indiana thus far. And I think, while obviously Penn State has one of the largest living alumni networks, a lot of resources to be able to dump into football, a very storied program, it also comes with the question of why haven't they been able to get the job done? And he would have to head into Penn State, head into Happy Valley with a little bit of uncertainty about what goes on. Is it like, from the outside looking in, I would be wondering, was it James Franklin? Is it a higher up issue? Is it an allocation of resources issue? It doesn't seem to be on the outside, but those are things that you really aren't going to get like the best idea possible until you're in that role. I think he's very safe in Indiana right now. He seems very happy there. I think, once again, the notoriety of being able to establish yourself at a lesser program and turn them into something great is something that is going to beget him more opportunities going forward, ones that could potentially be better than Penn State in terms of maybe leaving for the NFL at some point. Those are all things that can be on his radar with his success at Indiana. So I don't know if I would necessarily be itching to leave, especially to one that Penn State has a lot of questions surrounding them right now. So I don't know. They definitely will hit his line. They definitely will try to offer him a lot of money. But I think it depends on how much he values football and how much he values his own legacy. Because right now he's building something very nice at Indiana.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't believe in Indiana as a long-term project. And I think that's probably the difference between you and me is do I think Indiana is going to be better than it has been historically? Do I think it has some of that old money that's starting to flow in there and you're starting to see it show up in the NIL realm? Sure. So I think Indiana could be a very solid middle of the pack Big Ten program. I think it could be better than a Wisconsin or a Michigan State, that level of program. Do I think it's going to become a blue blood with Curt Cignetti as the coach? I'm still doubtful of that. That's a lot of time, and he is 64, so that is something that's weighing into the equation as well. Isaiah, let's do the first name on my Penn State should talk to them, even though I think a lot of people are not necessarily talking about him as a candidate. Eli Drinkwitz at Missouri. Dug into his profile. It's very interesting. Really doesn't come off any interesting coaching trees. Has no NFL exposure. Doesn't have ties anywhere close to Pennsylvania or Penn State. He is from different parts of the country. That's where he's made his bones. But the guy wins. He's been, I think it's well over a 600 winning percentage at a place like Missouri in the SEC. He's got some big wins on his resume. Notably, he beat Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl a couple of years ago. That's something Penn State has not been able to do. Granted, it was a bowl game. Was Ohio State playing all their guys? Probably not. But still, he beat Ohio State. It's on the resume. He wins a lot. And I think he's a candidate that Penn State has to look at because he seems like a guy who has done less or done more with less. I think he's in that same category of Curt Cignetti. If you give this guy the resources, what can he do? Also, famously, he put a scare into Penn State in 2019, that Appalachian State game at Beaver Stadium. I remember being at a wedding for that one, Isaiah. And a lot of people were watching that one on the phone. So I remember that game pretty vividly. I think he's a really good coach. He's definitely not the sexiest name on this list, but the problem is Penn State wants to win. And this guy, to me, is probably one of the most proven winners of anyone we've been talking about in terms of being a head coach.
I definitely see the point. I don't know if I'm completely on board with it for Penn State. I think the biggest question is, once again, even though he's been able to win, if you look at some of the rank wins that he's had, none of them are exceedingly high in the rankings. Number 15, Kansas State. Number 24, Kentucky. Number 14, Tennessee in 2023. Tennessee is by far the most impressive name on that list. And then number 24, Boston College in 2024. None of them at the time when they won were those top 10 teams. And I think that's the mark that Penn State is really looking to try and overcome. There really wasn't much of a question in terms of Penn State being able to beat teams like Boise State last year or SMU, like against those ranked programs that had solid years, but we know historically don't have the backing, or just had a solid year, but we know that they weren't a threat to a program like Penn State that is going to be able to attract these recruits and have a stacked roster at every level. So I think the biggest question is, in terms of winning, are you moving laterally or are you moving up? Because when it comes to overall winning percentage, James Franklin has a phenomenal one outside of those top 10 teams. So in terms of being able to consistently beat Big Ten conference opponents, in terms of being able to consistently beat lower end ranked opponents, he didn't fare badly at all in that regard. So I think the biggest question is, are you going to move on to somebody who, in terms of his own coaching history, doesn't have as much as somebody like James Franklin, and also has a relatively similar resume against the middle of the pack to average team? I think that's going to be the big question for Penn State. Yeah,
well, I think the big problem is you're not going to find anyone who is consistently great against top 10 teams. There's a reason most teams lose to top 10 teams. It's because the top 10 teams are significantly better. So it's going to be hard to find that unicorn anywhere at this point for Penn State that A, is going to have the resume you want, and B, is going to be willing to come to Penn State for the money you're willing to pay. So that's why I like Eli Drinkwitz. I think that there is some upside there as a demonstrated winner who has beaten those teams consistently. Then it's just a question of, can he do what James Franklin did not in a better position, start beating some of those top 10 teams. Isaiah, the next name on the list is probably the most controversial, I think, because maybe polarizing is the better word, because I think there's a lot of people who really love him, and I think there's a lot of people who really do not want to see him at Penn State. That is Matt Rhule, the Nebraska head coach. I would count myself in the latter camp. I wrote, on postgazette.com, I said, listen, this is the Paterno legacy candidate. That's why he's here. He's 64-57 all time as a college head coach, flamed out at the NFL level. If he did not have connections to Penn State, we would not be having a conversation about him in any way. The pertinence against top teams, he's 2-23 against the Associated Press top 25 all time. That's worse than James Franklin by quite a margin. 0-11 against the top 10. So he is all of the things Penn State fans say that they hated about James Franklin. He is all of those, just with khakis on, just with wearing the black tennies out there like Joe Pa did, doing the cosplay. That's the only reason we're talking about this guy at all. I think it's a preposterous conversation that he is someone you'd consider throwing a huge bag at, because he's already making significant money at Nebraska. This is the revenge of the Paterno people. And if you followed me in my career at any point since I left Penn, me and James Franklin, I was hired at the Post-Gazette like a week after James Franklin was hired at Penn State. And so if you followed any of my work over the last 12 years, you know that I believe strongly that Penn State should be moving on from Joe Paterno and that legacy and everything associated with him. But there are still people, and there's probably a lot of you listening at the moment, who want to go back to that period of time. Never mind that James Franklin was more consistent than Joe Paterno over Joe Paterno's last 25 years. James Franklin was a better coach than Paterno pretty much post-1986. Never mind the ditch that Joe Paterno's actions led the program into that required James Franklin to build out from. Never mind all that. People still want to go back to that period of time, Isaiah. Do you have any? Are you going to talk me out of this at all? Because I'm kind of going fire and brimstone here. I don't think Matt Rhule's the guy.
I would, I'm agreeing with you. I really don't understand why this is in conversation. I mean, I think if I'm going to play devil's advocate, the best thing regarding the situation is that he's having a very solid start at Nebraska this year. They're 5-1. That lone loss is against Michigan by 3 points. So 3 points off of an undefeated season thus far. Obviously, the competition hasn't been great, but it also hasn't been the worst I've ever seen ever. But, even when Matt Rhule was asked about it, he's making a bag at Nebraska. He's very happy there. I think you obviously have to say those things for optics. Like, he's not going to come out and sit there and say, oh, Penn State hit me up immediately. I would love to go there. Not damaging any relations, not burning any bridges. He went on to say, oh, I met my wife there. It's my alma mater. I love Pat. So kind of just really just getting people's hopes up in terms of potentially leaving. But I don't really understand why there would be much to get your hopes up to begin there anyway. He's okay. Like, it's just the definition of average to me as a move. It's definitely a downgrade. And that was my biggest fear with moving on from Franklin to begin with, is that if you move on from him, who's the guy that's going to take his place? And if it is Matt that ends up taking his spot, then there's a lot of problems for Penn State moving forward. And I don't have much faith in them that this is going to be a positive next couple of years.
Well, and let's just be honest. When you say there's a lot of people that have a lot of money at Penn State that want him, that may be all that matters. And especially, this is the part of the show where I call out Neely Bendapuni for cutting all of the branch campuses. WPSU almost went dark because of budget cuts at Penn State. The way Penn State has been managed financially suggests that if people are willing to write checks to Matt Rhule because of the connection to Paterno, that may be all that matters. And all this other stuff about on the field just may not be as important as whatever Penn State's aspirations are in terms of getting donation money in, paying off some of this buyout to James Franklin. If he's a feel-good candidate for a chunk of the fan base that's willing to pay for him, that's sometimes how these decisions get made. I obviously strongly disagree with it, but I'm not going to write off his candidacy because I think that he has an ability to extract donations from this fan base that pretty much any other coach does not. So we will see how that unfolds with Matt Rhule. The next name on my should list, Isaiah, is Joe Brady, the Buffalo Bills offensive coordinator. Famously, he worked under Joe Moorhead on the offensive staff of the 2016 Big Ten championship team. moves on to LSU, passing game coordinator for the 2019 national championship run with Joe Burrow. Been in the NFL pretty much ever since. Worked his way up to being the offensive coordinator for the Buffalo Bills. This one is complicated, Isaiah, because Terry Pegula is the owner of the Buffalo Bills. So he is also a Penn State mega donor in ways that make him almost a quasi-owner of the Nittany Lions as well. So it's a question of, would he let Joe Brady go from his pro team to his college team to coach the college team? I think you could make arguments both ways. I do love the resume, Isaiah. I think he comes from, great stock. I think he'd be a solid option for Penn State, but the Terry Pegula factor, I think, makes it a kind of murky situation.
I agree. It's interesting because you could honestly use that to argue both ways. But yes. I think right now, for the first time in a little bit, the Bills don't own the conference. Patriots are 4-2 right alongside with them. Patriots actually beat them head-to-head. Josh Allen didn't look that great. Do I think that by any means that it's serious enough to warrant looking on to a new offensive coordinator? No, not by any stretch of the means. But it always begets these conversations. But I do think that because Terry Pegula has those ties as a mega donor to Penn State, the biggest question around Penn State has always been their passing game. Right now is the first time in a long time we're having these conversations about the defense and defensive coordinators and schemes. That's usually not a question that we usually have with Penn State. Run game has been very consistent for years. We've seen a lot of great running backs come out of there. Obviously right now with Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, the running game is never going to be too much of a problem. But the biggest thing is always the passing game. And I think that somebody like Joe Brady, if he were to come in with this program as currently constructed, it would be rough, because given the wide receiver core that we have right now, or Penn State has right now, it's Trevor Pena, draft eligible, Devontae Ross, draft eligible, Kyron Hudson. These are all upperclassmen. These are guys that are going to be able to leave if they decide to stay another year. I don't know all of their eligibilities off the top of my head, but it would be rough on paper if a lot of those guys didn't end up coming back. And then also with the quarterback now being Grunkelmeyer, it's a question of the passing game looks as shaky as ever, with even more unanswered questions than ever before, because now Aller isn't at the helm. And it's a matter of, could Joe Brady come in and revitalize and completely revamp this long-term weakness for the Nittany Lions? So I do think that it's absolutely somebody that they should consider. Obviously, that 2019 passing offense for LSU was historic. To see Joe Burrow do what he did with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson was nothing short of incredible. Do I think that Penn State has the history of a dominant passing game or the weapons to be able to replicate that by any means? No, but I think it would put to test Joe Brady's ability as an offensive coordinator. And I do think that once again, with the resource base and kind of the notoriety that Penn State has, he might be able to attract some very, very high level recruits who are interested in being able to develop their game under possibly the best passing offense in college football history with LSU.
Yeah, I think that I'm not concerned with what Penn State has stocked, because I think if you put a Joe Brady in there and he's a guy players want to play for, they're going to come here. You saw Penn State somewhat reload at the position this year. I think they're a little bit better receiver than they were a year ago, considering those guys caught no passes. But I think that if you had someone that transfers could believe in, guys that may be in good positions at programs but want to be in better ones, it might entice them to transfer, even if they're not immediately in the portal. So that's part of the benefit of possibly hiring someone sooner. I think that's the other big drawback with Joe Brady is if the Buffalo goes on an extended run in the playoffs, possibly as far as the Super Bowl, what's his availability to be the guy at Penn State? So that would probably be a big drawback that, hypothetically, unless Buffalo really goes in the tank here, which would kind of tank his candidacy too, might be just tough to pull that one off logistically, but certainly a candidate I'd be very interested in if I was Penn State. Next guy on my will consider list is Manny Diaz, Penn State's former defensive coordinator, dominant in 2023, second in total defense, third in scoring defense. He had great units at Penn State. He has recruiting ties mostly in the South, where there's more talent to work with than in the Northeast. So I think that is an important asset that Manny Diaz would bring to the table. The problem is You do still have Jim Knowles under a massive contract, and it's not been confirmed one way or the other, Isaiah, whether he would be in or out on the next coaching staff. I can imagine Pat Kraft telling the next guy, listen, this is our defensive coordinator. He won a national championship at Ohio State. We're spending a lot of money on him. You're going to figure it out with him. So if Jim Knowles stayed, then you have Manny Diaz. It somewhat seems like a duplication of expertise. I think you'd probably want to lean more toward an offensive guy. But, Manny Diaz does have the ties here and might be able to entice a solid offensive coordinator along the way. So what's your read on him as a potential successor to James Franklin?
I'm a little iffy on it just because I do agree with you wholeheartedly on the point that it would be a duplication of expertise. And if anything, a potential clash of expertise, given the fact that Penn State has struggled so much defensively this season. They're definitely a far cry from what they were in 23 and 24. And I think getting the guy who was able to elevate this unit with a lot of the same guys to an elite level defense and pairing him with the coordinator in Knowles that had the expectations on paper, had the better resume, and led a better defense, who is now players are struggling to learn the system and there's so many questions around it. I think that in itself would beget a very, I don't want to say toxic, but it would be a very tense environment, it feels like. And I definitely do agree that the head coach, given that history, should probably be more offensively minded for Penn State. I'm not against it as somebody who knows what Manny Diaz can do on the defensive side of the ball. But obviously, you mentioned in your article his record at 21-15 in Miami before he got fired and inevitably became the coordinator at Penn State. And then 13-6 at Duke thus far. Duke is 4-2 this year. They've been solid, especially for an ACC team that necessarily has no prominent football history or consistent prominent football history, I should say. So he's done some good things, but I think there would be a lot of clashing between the two.
Yeah, and listen, I still have hope for the Jim Knowles system. I think what we've learned clearly this season, and I've heard a lot of Ohio State, centric people talk about it takes time for his system to work. I think that was probably one of the reasons that James Franklin's no longer here, is that you shouldn't have been hiring someone that needed time to put in a system for this team. This was a team that had national championship expectations. You should have brought someone who was a finisher. But he's here now, and you're going to go through the growing pains of implementing this system. Why not, see it through with Jim Knowles? And in that regard, yes, I think you do want a little more offensive know-how in the head coach position to counterbalance that. And if it doesn't work with Jim Knowles in a couple of years, then you let him go, and maybe you change your calculus a little bit. But for now, to me, you can't hire someone who's so defensively minded when you have Jim Knowles on your staff, basically almost getting a head coach salary in a lot of places. Next name on the should talk to list, Isaiah, is PJ Fleck from Minnesota. I've always been, listen, he's got the shtick, the ski-u-ma, the row the boat stuff. And, I've never loved the shtick. I think a lot of people don't love the shtick, but you can't really argue with the results there. Upset Penn State in I think it was 2019, got to the Big Ten championship game, has a number of solid seasons since then, has not gone nuclear, has not won big at a national level. That's going to be the big critique of his resume. But I think his style fits a lot with Penn State's identity. It's a bruising ball control type of offense. I think Penn State only touched the ball 8 times in that game in 2019. That's how he wants to win games. I think a lot of Penn Staters would like that style if they started seeing Penn State play that way. A strong running game with some big plays in the passing game at the right moments. So I like PJ Fleck for similar reasons to Eli Drinkwitz. If you can't get Eli Drinkwitz out of Missouri, I think PJ Fleck is another out of the Penn State universe type of guy you could look at and say, we think he could have success here.
It's definitely a solid move, I will say. I think given the state of Penn State's roster right now, and I mean, obviously it's going to look very different a year from now. I can't really say what I think it's going to look like, but given its current identity with having such a prolific rushing duo, you would have historically and at the moment to have the offense be that punch you in the mouth, run down the middle style offense that's going to lull these defense into a full sense of security against the passing game. It doesn't have to be a super dominant passing game. It just has to be one that can shine in the big moments and execute when needed. And I think given the state of how a lot of these Penn State teams have looked in the past, that identity mixed with the level of like what the roster looks like for Penn State historically, I think would be a very good identity. So it's not one that I shy away from. I think once again, with Drinkwitz, it has a very similar concern just in terms of, okay, do we consider this to be a move laterally? Is this actually like a notch down? But with Franklin gone, you have to find somebody to fill that role. And if it's not going to be Terry Smith, who's currently in the driver's seat, then it should definitely be somebody who's been able to execute. He has more experience than Drinkwitz. So I like it in that regard.
Yeah, and I think another big appeal with these head coaches is they should have some built-in roster continuity. You take a bunch of guys from one program, you put them into the other. There's different uniforms on them. You're in a different place, but theoretically, you're importing a program now in the transfer portal era, more so than just taking a coach and having to go out and find players or having him have to coach players that aren't his. There's going to be some overlap with the current Penn State roster. There's going to be some guys that don't come from Minnesota or Missouri or wherever you get a head coach from, but you have the ability now to import a program a little bit more. And I think Minnesota is in that second rung of Big Ten programs that, if you're at Penn State, there's some things to be impressed about. Certainly not the sexiest name on the list, but again, I'd give him a long look before some of these other names I think they might be more interested in. Speaking of, the next name on my they will consider list is Al Golden, the Cincinnati Bengals current defensive coordinator. Not going great over there right now, but Cincinnati notably decided to invest all of their money on the offensive side of the ball with Joe Burrow. So do I hold Al Golden, who just showed up a couple of months ago, responsible for what the Cincinnati defense looks like? No, I do not. I've watched too much Bengals football in my life, Isaiah, to blame it all on him. He was basically Matt Rhule before Matt Rhule for the Paterno people at Penn State. Another Penn State grad with deep ties to the program, deep ties to Joe Paterno, has success at Temple, goes to Miami, flames out. Since then, you've rarely heard people talk about him because he got a chance at a big program and failed. That said, Isaiah, he didn't just wander off into the wilderness. He's been doing NFL jobs. Then famously last season, he's the defensive coordinator for Notre Dame, did some incredible work, delivered that win against Georgia in the Sugar Bowl that I thought was a masterpiece, beats Penn State in the Orange Bowl, stymied this Indiana team that is looking more and more like a buzzsaw. That win in the college football playoff first round last year is looking more and more impressive for Al Golden. You factor in that there's NFL experience. That's a thing that players care about, and I think there's a lot to like about Al Golden in comparison to Matt Rhule because I think he's gone through the wilderness. He's built up the resume since everything flamed out at Miami. Do I like him objectively? Probably not, for the same reasons that I don't like Matt Rhule. I don't like we got to find a Paterno person to run this program. But if I had to pick between the two, I'm more interested in Al Golden than I am in Matt Rhule.
I agree. I think he has more upside to him. I think he's done objectively better. I think obviously when you look at his time in Notre Dame, it's incredibly impressive. So that in itself, I mean, listen, it got him an opportunity to go to the NFL. So we can't really knock that in any way, shape, or form. And I'm going to let you be the Bengals expert in this situation because I don't watch enough Bengals football to directly pin it on somebody. I just know the defense is horrific. So that in itself is already enough to make me question just hearing off of name. But we're going to put the bias to the side and try and look at this objectively from what he was able to accomplish at the college level. And once again, to your point, regardless of whether he succeeded in the NFL or not, somebody who's been in that environment, has been around professionals, has been around people of incredible talent, that in itself is always going to be enough to draw some people in, as opposed to having no NFL experience at all and not being familiar with what coaching and operating at that next level looks like. So not my favorite name by any stretch of the means, but it's definitely not one that I dislike as much as Matt Rhule.
Yeah, I'd put him, above Matt Rhule in the pecking order for me. But yes, still behind a number of names on this list, including, and this is the next name on my should talk to him list, Brian Hartline, the Ohio State offensive coordinator. famously was their wide receivers coach before that and has worked with all of the names I'm about to read, which is truly incredible when you think about it, Isaiah. Terry McLaurin, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka, Jeremiah Smith there currently. We were talking about the receivers earlier. It's been Penn State's sorest point in the later years of the Franklin regime. Clearly, Brian Hartline knows what he's doing with receivers. That alone does not necessarily qualify him for the job, but you're also the offensive coordinator on a national championship team a year ago. I believe he was the co-coordinator a year ago. He's now the full offensive coordinator now. But regardless, you were an instrumental part in an offense that won a national championship. And on the recruiting trail, Ohio State's one of the few programs that consistently can kick Penn State's butt. And so if you import an offensive coordinator from that national championship team at Ohio State, if you have already imported the defensive coordinator, there is very quickly a nice sales pitch you can make to any recruit saying, listen, the brain trust is at Penn State now. Ryan Day might still be over here, might still be Ohio State, but the guys who got Ryan Day there, who had those same big game questions that James Franklin faced until last year, really until you get to the college football playoff run. After the loss to Michigan, they were ready to fire him. If he doesn't win the national championship, he might get fired. He does win the national championship, but if you're Penn State and you have one of those guys running the show and another guy running your defense, I think there's a very there's a good story to tell for Brian Hartline. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it would be a shock if Penn State was able to pry him away from Columbus, considering he played for Ohio State. He is scarlet and gray all the way through. I don't think it's going to happen for a variety of reasons, but definitely one of the names that most appeals to me on an objective basis.
Yeah, it doesn't seem likely by any stretch of the means, but man, would it be great. To your point, from a recruiting standpoint, you mentioned it, we just spoke about it a little bit earlier. The passing game has always been kind of the sore spot that we hate to talk about when it comes to Penn State. And I know from it being from our perspective that it's highlighted even more and heightened even more for anybody who would have to participate in the passing game if they went to Penn State. There's a reason they haven't been able to attract real talent at the wide receiver position. There's a reason that people are looking at Penn State even now and decommitting, but I feel like those question marks have always been there in terms of, I mean, if you look at Penn State's history at both quarterback and receiver, I mean, you got some notable guys. You got Dotson, you have Allen Robinson, but in terms of that level of these are the receivers that Penn State has produced and then the receivers that Ohio State has produced, I mean, that list is incredible to sit there. Every single one of them, Terry McLaurin, Garrett Wilson, Olave, the list goes on. Aside from Jeremiah Smith, who's still there, they're all amazing at the NFL level. And to say that probably the worst one at this current point of time is Marvin Harrison Jr. is insane. So I think that in itself, being able to attract wide receivers and being able to attract people who would be interested in learning from somebody who played such a major role in developing these elite wide receivers, it could go for a whole culture shift within Happy Valley. We could see Penn State become a pass-oriented offense depending on the guys that they're able to attract within a year or two if this was a move that they were able to make. So once again, I don't think it's very likely, but I think it would definitely transform the whole dynamic of the offense in itself.
Yeah, and listen, a year ago, I don't think any of us thought we'd be talking about Jim Knowles, defensive coordinator at Penn State either. They were able to get that deal done. Maybe if you can put enough of a bag together, you could get Brian Hartline here as well. Two names left on my lists. Isaiah, we got D'Anton Lynn. He's off of my will list. I think they will consider him. And then I got Will Stein as he's on my should list, the guy that they should consider. Let's start with D'Anton Lynn. Again, he's another legacy guy that I think they're going to give a long look to. I think a lot of people overlook him in a lot of situations because he doesn't have the resume that an Al Golden or a Matt Rhule does, but he does check the Joe Paterno box for people, does have that lineage, does have that part as part of his story. He's coached at the NFL level. His dad is Anthony Lynn, who I've only ever heard good things about. Obviously had that stint with the Chargers, but he's always one of those guys that people take there's a high level of respect for Anthony Lynn on any staff that he's on. Kind of reminds me of the way people talk about Terry Smith, currently Penn State's interim coach. So D'Anton Lynn has that lineage, and someone he's learned the profession from. And then I think the third very interesting thing about him is that he has such deep connections to Southern California now, where there is a lot of talent, and that Penn State now has probably more access to playing on the West Coast once a year. Basically, they were at USC a year ago, UCLA this year. Believe they're going to Seattle a year from now, and then it'll be Oregon the following year, and then you're going to start the cycle over again. So Penn State's going to be out on the West Coast a lot. Parents are going to be able to see their kids play for Penn State on the West Coast a lot, be able to save themselves a trip. So if D'Anton Lynn has those ties to those very talent-rich, get that down into Orange County, just some really very solid high school programs that D'Anton Lynn has attacked from both sides. He's been at UCLA and he's been at USC. I think there's an underrated dark horse package there, and I think there's an upside that if we're going to talk about I think there's people that I like on this list more than him objectively. But if I'm putting him on the Penn State legacy continuum, I think I like him better than both Al Golden and Matt Rhule because I think there's an upside factor there. I'd like to see him get a chance to run the program. It's also interesting because we were in school together at the same time, Isaiah.
Oh, wow. Look at that. I have to agree, honestly. I do feel like in itself, when we look at those legacy candidates, he's probably one of my favorites to the point of just his history of both, recruiting wise for USC and UCLA. He'd be able to draw a lot of guys from there. There's a lot of talent down south over there. But I also do think that his NFL stops, you mentioned just how having that NFL experience is like imperative to being able to draw recruits in from all over the country, just because they want to know that you are familiar with what coaching and what people are looking for at that next level. So it stops at just looking at this Jets, Bills, Chargers, Texans, the Ravens, whether it's as an assistant or not, it's still something that shows that he was valued by multiple staffs and some very decent programs included in there. The Texans recently have been solid, Bills, Ravens. These are programs that have been able to achieve at a relatively high level, at least some terms of the regular season. Texans not so much right now, but that's neither here or there. But solid programs that have found value in him. And then it seems like he would have a lot of ties, especially considering his father. So I would say I'm on board with this. He probably would be my favorite of the legacy candidates as well.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if he. I'd be shocked if they didn't at least talk to him. Given the Penn State connection. If he didn't have the Penn State connection, maybe not. But if the Penn State's connection is enough to get Matt Rhule at the very top of these lists, it should be enough to get D'Anton Lynn at least an interview. Isaiah, let's wrap up the show here with Will Stein, the Oregon offensive coordinator. Look, this is probably the high risk, high reward pick. He's got 3 years I think 4 years as a coordinator total, 1 at UTSA, 3 at Oregon. That is pretty much it in terms of the resume. I don't know what kind of recruiter he is, would be. I think there's a lot of boxes he does not check, but I have a high level of respect for what Dan Lanning has done at Oregon. I think he is the prototype coach for this new age in terms of running these programs, earning buy-in from various stakeholders, motivating a team. I love Dan Lanning a lot, and I think Will Stein's as close as you're going to get for Penn State. So he's beaten Penn State a couple of times. You know what that offense looks like. You know what it's capable of when it's rolling. So I understand the criticisms that will be, coming of his resume. But if you want to get a guy with the Dan Lanning DNA into your program and just the progressive manner in which he's conducted a program, I think Will Stein's got to be on the list of people you at least give a call to.
And I couldn't agree more. I'm always somebody who, I think recency drives me a lot of my decisions. I feel like what you've done, for some of these more storied guys, some of these people who had decades of coaching experience, you can be storied, you can have had great success in the past, but if you're not winning recently, then, I'm going to look past some of that right now, because who you are in current years matters to me. And if we look at what he's been able to do for Oregon, I think the most impressive thing that he's done, not only being able to beat Penn State twice, but if you look at it from who he's going up against, he obviously was able to take down a Manny Diaz defense, which was significantly better than what the Noles defense is right now for Penn State. But being able to beat the Noles defense when they inevitably lost to the Noles defense against Ohio State, I think it shows a level of adaptation. And I think that's something that's very important, to be able to scheme against different things and prepare for different things, different styles of play. So that in itself, even though he's young with little experience, he's done a lot of good in that short amount of time. Now, do I think that is going to warrant him jumping all the way up to head coach with no head coaching experience at any level objectively, or with any significant level? No, but I think it would be something that, once again, what Dan Lanning has been able to do for Oregon is tremendous. And if you could get even a speck of that, a hint of that from Will Stein, I think it's a move that Penn State should at least consider.
Yeah, I think it's a high risk, high reward gamble type of situation. I don't imagine Penn State taking that kind of gamble with the gamble that they've already taken, Isaiah, in firing James Franklin. In a lot of ways it was time, but in a lot of ways you've rolled the dice with the stability that you had and the high floor that Penn State had as a program. Do you take two big gambles in a row? Probably not. So I think Will Stein's also unlikely. If you had to ask me who I think it's going to be off of this list at the end of the day, I really don't see a way around it being Matt Rhule. Just all the circumstances. Maybe Curt Cignetti would be my number 2 bet. But I think with a lot of names on these lists, there's also enough downsides that Matt Rhule's downsides kind of get balanced out, Isaiah. I don't know who's your favorite. Who's your favorite for the job in terms of realistically who you think they're going to hire, less so than who you'd like to see them hire?
I mean, obviously who I'd like to see them hire is Curt Cignetti. That's not a question, just in terms of what he's been able to do. But I think out of everybody going through it, I think Drinkwitz is probably the one that I think is within realistic expectations. You get to see somebody who's had success against ranked teams, albeit not the highest of caliber of ranked teams, but ranked teams nonetheless. And then to see him in a situation where you're with way more resources and much bigger network, way bigger destination for a lot of these recruits. I think obviously it might be a little bit rough for Penn State now, but there's no question that a program as storied as this is going to be able to bounce back and is going to have no problem drawing in recruits in the future, just because the name alone is going to continue to attract coaches. It's going to continue to attract coordinators, recruits. Like, it's done enough for so long to be able to keep that reputation alive. So I think with somebody like Drinkwitz, who's been able to show up in big moments relative to, what he's played in, I do think that, and Missouri isn't a powerhouse program in the SEC. So I think that in itself, comparing it to a powerhouse in the Big Ten, one of the top 3 teams historically in the Big Ten, I think that in itself would make it a very possible move. And I think there's a lot of upside for it if he is as good as he's, been so far at Mizzou.
Yeah, I like the Drinkwitz package a lot. It's just, if you put him side by side with Matt Rhule, I think for a lot of people, they're going to want what they view as the more known commodity in the Penn State guy. I tend to agree with you, Isaiah, but we'll see. We'll see if Matt Rhule wants to come here. I think that's also something of an open question. I think he'd have a hard time saying no, regardless of what he says from the podium in Lincoln. So certainly a lot of interesting factors to watch play out. Tune into this, I guess, a month or 2 months, 3 months, 4 months from now. We might look really smart. We might look really dumb, but it was fun to break it all down with you today, Isaiah. We'll be back next week, probably with more regular programming, talking about the team, trying to make the most of what remains of the season. But I thought it was important to get into the candidates today. So if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. And of course, check out all of our written work at post-gazette.com. We will talk to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.